Does Tim O'Brien accurately portray PTSD in his book, In the Lake of the Woods? PTSD stands for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. PTSD can develop after any traumatic event. The traumatic event usually occurs to the victim or a loved one of the victim. In the book, Tim O'Brien uses the Vietnam War as the traumatic event that caused John's PTSD. The My Lai massacre played the central role in John's PTSD. Signs and symptoms of PTSD. The first sign is nightmares or otherwise difficulty sleeping. In the book, it is described that John fell asleep fine, but he had a lot of trouble staying asleep. On page 29, O'Brien says he couldn't stay asleep. It was as if he was on guard against something. Another common sign is uncontrollable or violent thoughts. John had multiple scary thoughts that appeared out of nowhere throughout the entire book. On page 5, he says how he wanted to scream the most terrible things he could scream, and how he couldn't stop screaming terrible things inside of his head. Another sign John shows is trouble remembering the traumatic event. John had little to no memory of the massacre. He pretended he couldn't have done it, and therefore he hadn't. He pretended that if the secret stayed inside of him, with all the other secrets, he could fool the world and fool himself. PTSD also leads to troubles in relationships and other problems with loved ones. John and Kathy's relationship became much more strained after the war than it was beforehand. But even then, they felt some strain. It was as if they were making their way up a huge white mountain, always struggling, sometimes just hanging on. Lastly, O'Brien uses psychotic behavior to further show John's PTSD. John burned the plants and talked to himself. He also remembered events without any prelude. He wanted to hurt things. He wanted to grab a knife and start slashing and never stop. John also had multiple risk factors for PTSD. The unpredictable environment John was exposed to due to his career in politics made PTSD all the more worse in his head. John also had a large lack of social support because almost no one knew what John had dealt with. This made John especially susceptible to PTSD. Tim O'Brien is accurate with his portrayal of PTSD because John has nightmares and difficulty sleeping. John and Kathy's relationship becomes much more strained. John has multiple uncontrollable and scary thoughts. John shows psychotic behavior, and John has multiple risk factors.
Created using Powtoon.